Lauren, we made it. Hello, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you tonight to the opening of exhibition Interrupted, an installation of the work of Professor Munly. I'd like to start with a brief introduction of Professor Munly, who I'm sure many of you already know, and I hope you had a chance to learn from her during your studies here at Syracuse. Professor Munly is a licensed architect and partner at Munly Brown Studio, a design consultancy formed with Professor Ted Brown. Their studio has a fascinating range of work and collection of projects that range from material research to master planning. And all of this is weaved together by their dedication to environmental, social, and economic sustainability. They have been recipients of several awards, national and international, and Professor Munly herself has received an endowment for the arts, a national endowment for the arts, a New York State Council for the Humanities, grants and awards from the Boston Foundation for Architecture, the American Academy in Rome, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, among others. I promised you I wouldn't miss a single award, so here I am. Professor Munly received a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Virginia and a master's from Princeton University. She has been with the School of Architecture here for over 30 years and has taught undergraduate, graduate studios, and seminars looking at American urban settlement, theories of utopia, and modern dwelling. She has also taught in Syracuse abroad programs, London, Florence, Japan, and directed both the Syracuse Architecture in London and Florence programs. Being the remarkable teacher that she is, as many of you probably know far better than me, she was in 2006 named the Laura J. and L. Douglas Meredith Professor of Teaching Excellence for outstanding teaching. Professor Munly is someone who values expertise and cross-disciplinary collaboration and has been dedicated to broadening discourse within the field. And she's initiated a host of interdisciplinary initiatives with colleagues in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, the College of Visual and Performing Arts, and the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. On a final and personal note, I just wanted to say I couldn't be more honored to be here tonight with the both of you. The last event I did in real life before this change in all of our realities was with the both of you in Slocum Hall. And there is something incredibly optimistic about being together again and sharing space and ideas in this beautiful exhibition.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And Evie, I just wanted to say, I'm really happy that we're here in this room and we're doing this streaming online. And those of you out there in TV land can't really see the incredible cast of characters we have here in the background making this all possible. And also, very importantly, this is the first day that I've been out of sweatpants in 9 months. So I'm really happy about that.
That makes two of us.
And I think you wanted to talk a little bit about Exhibition Interrupted. And, you know, we're sitting in this interesting room. We were just waiting for this, looking at the plaque, which isn't so visible in the Zoom, but this was a building dedicated by Mrs. Russell Sage. And this was the entry room to Slocum Hall. So back in the day, there was a big flight of stairs that went out to College Place. And I think if you all watched the video that Zain El-Wakil has made, which is this beautiful video, you can see some of those images. But sometime in the 60s, that was just chopped off. And I remember when I first got here thinking, you know, it's kind of strange that we enter this building, you know, from the north and south ends. And it's a big building, but you're coming in through a side door, very odd. And this room was behind locked doors and full of storage. You could kind of see boxes in here, but it was really not part of the life of the school at all. No one ever came in here. It was off limits. And I think that kind of idea that this was an interstitial space, but had lost that role and really didn't know what it wanted to be, couldn't act anymore, we'll say, as a kind of entry lobby. is really a kind of fascinating piece of its history. So Michael, when you got here, you made this idea that, well, this is going to become our exhibition gallery. So it's taken on this kind of new life, but it's certainly not transitory in the way that it was designed to be. And I find that really fascinating. In fact, the marble, it's called the Marble Room, and we can see the marble in the image in the walls behind us, really is fascinating in the way that it kind of sits between the big atrium and the rest of the school back here and the exterior. So I know you wanted to talk a little bit about that idea of interruption, and certainly this room was interrupted. Certainly it was sort of taken out of commission, and in that sense is really open to some kind of new use or new ideas about it. I guess
well, maybe I would like to say just what a pleasure it is to be here with Anne and with Evie. We were just saying earlier that Evie just repeated that we were all together out in the atrium space not too long ago, because I think you moderated the lecture that Evie did, and with her partner more than a year ago. But it's for me a great pleasure to be here, especially following Anne as she developed this project and did such a kind of an incredible detective work on this space in this room. I remember not too long ago when I arrived, Anne was telling me, this is years ago when I arrived here, this is my 8th year, so I hadn't been here long. And I don't know if you remember this, but we talked a little bit about this room, and it had been closed off. And I know when I first arrived, people wanted to turn this into like a bar, like the AA, right? Everybody has an idea for this room, and I think it has turned out to be a really terrific space for exhibitions. It's an incredibly challenging space, both for sound, but also just like, what do you do with the walls? They're all, they're marble, and they're similar. But anyway, it's great to be in this room with both of you, and especially to celebrate Anne's illustrious and remarkable and great career here at the school, and not more importantly, but just as importantly, to celebrate her work and recent work that she's done, which we're surrounded by, and talk about that. So I feel very lucky to be here with you both.
Thank you. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, I think it was last summer, and I believe Zane has captured a little bit of this in some of his videos. I was still sketching as if we were going to have a live show in here. Didn't have a name yet. I was thinking about different kinds of names and contents. And I remember, like, there was going to be a big arc of screens right along here. In fact, some of the models that may show up in the image, these little laser cut models, they were made thinking that I would have this kind of big arc, and you would come in through one door. I was going to close the center doors. You'd come in, and you'd have to go behind that arc and then emerge on the other side. And I was going to somehow display earlier work there. And what I didn't like about that idea is that it took the screens and it made them kind of display podiums instead of just being a screen.
Right.
You know? But anyway, I remember having this conversation, and I was sketching, and we were on Zoom because it was in the summer. And you kind of very gently broke the news to me. You didn't even say it like, this can't happen. You just said, it's possible that, maybe we will still have some shutdowns. And it was a very gentle kind of thing. And I remember thinking, we're talking April, Michael. That's a long way off. But anyway, we made the decision.
Turned out not to be so long off.
We made the decision that this was going to have to either wait a year or, which an idea I didn't want to really entertain,
Indeed, yeah.
or do something that sort of took on the COVID problem. So that was another aspect of Interrupted, that, you know, it was a show that had an idea and then had to morph and change and couldn't really have an opening in the conventional sense. And it emerged this idea of Exhibition Interrupted, which is a kind of a hybrid.
And here we are.
And here we are.
And it's quite interesting, though, to think about exhibitions and galleries at large exist in a kind of space of isolation, and to have an exhibition kind of respond and converse, whether with the building itself, the marble room and all its presence, but also the very reality of COVID, of people not being able to enter the exhibition space. And it really kind of establishes a dialogue between the two, as well as the life of the building and all of its previous iterations and appendixes and all of your detective work that Michael was talking about.
Yeah, the palimpsest kind of idea of adding another layer to the room, and then maybe something that we'll talk about a little bit later, but adding the videos and then actually projecting the videos in this room. So there are all these layers that kind of hopefully enrich you know, the life of the school and also the exhibition. I know one of the things that we were talking about early on too was a lot of exhibitions that got caught right in between. You know, they were planned for a regular opening, couldn't have it, ended up having to film as if one were having an opening.
Right.
And sorry, you can't be here, and we wanted to try to avoid that. You know, for people who are physically in the building, yeah, you can come and visit, but we worked with a remarkable filmographer, Zain, mention your name again, Zain El Wakil, who is a fifth-year graduating senior in our program, who did remarkable videos, which will take on a kind of life as well after all of this. So that's been, gosh, I've learned a lot.
Can I propose that we see one of the overview
Yes,
videos and
yeah.
everybody can have an idea?
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
of-
let's
of
do
this
that.
space
Yeah.
we're in? So maybe we'll see the introductory video. They're beautiful, and
Thank you.
they do such justice to the work. I think that the very idea of the screen and its geometry and the way it kind of changes as you move around it could not have been captured in any other kind of medium.
I think you're right. I think it's remarkable to me what moving into the fourth dimension really does for this work. And of course, architecture requires that, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I've taught abroad so much is because I think it's so important for students to be out in the field. I was just showing a video of an interview with Shigeru Ban the other day in class, and in the video he talks about what's the most important thing for a student of architecture. He says travel. And I know it's a difficult time right now for that, but I think that eventually that will come back. And it's that being in space and moving through space and understanding the kind of effects of moving through space. I think that that's super important. So I agree completely with what you're saying. And the light and everything that changes as you move through these screens and through the room and outside of the room.
Mm.
And there's nothing static about them. They stand still and they sort of acquire this very specific forms that I'm also interested in talking to you about kind of arriving at.
Yeah.
And yeah, they feel responsive in ways that architecture very often is not. You know, we think of architecture as very static and singular and, you know, kind of following a single kind of presence across time. And they somehow are in conversation. And I know you've been making screens for many, many, many years in parallel to different kinds of architecture. So
these are bigger than anything I've made before. Really kind of difficult thing to pull off. And I suspect that for a while, after we're done with this discussion and we close, you know, some things here, the show will actually perform the way it should, where the way I had imagined, but it's going to be really, I think I'm realizing, very frustrating as well, because part of Exhibition Interrupted and also that earlier history we were talking about this room is playing with the idea of threshold and transition. So screens are great transitional devices for light and air and movement, as you said. This whole room was a transitional device at the scale of the building. This wall and the sets of doors that sort of show up, I think, in the video right now, are also part of the transition. And so eventually I had this idea that what we'll do is we'll just put screens in the doorways and really play that idea of threshold, really put the visitor in the threshold, like inside the wall, basically. And so that's where the different kinds of shapes come from. Is this one actually it kind of invades from the atrium. So you can kind of enter the room, but you really can't enter the room. So it's kind of a bladder, really, that comes in from the atrium. The middle one pushes from this room out into the atrium and becomes a kind of surrogate door, but it's, you know, really a kind of a light box as well. And the last one is on a pivot and is really aligned with the threshold, the marble threshold itself. Now, truth be told, that was also a very early experiment from last fall and was going to be one of these screens as part of a big arc that I was mentioning before. And I made one, and then we realized this can actually work really well in that doorway. That's what's going to happen with that one. So, you know, the idea is that you kind of have to dance back and forth across that threshold. And in doing that, you can look into the room and see the videos that are on the wall and see these objects that are scale versions in some cases of the screens. And I had never really intended that anyone would enter the room, although we're sitting in it right now. I was saying to Evie earlier that I've been approached by a number of students who would really, really like to get in here and look at things a little more closely. So I'm going to have to work with you, Michael, about maybe setting up a Saturday or something.
Of course, yeah.
We have a kind of, you know, what do you call it, back of house event where we come in and see the other side.
We will screen them.
Yes, right. So.
I think it's such a brilliant response because, you know, as you were mentioning, this space is meant to be a threshold and it's a gallery space with 12 doors. And, you know, there's nothing logical about this. Like, who mounts work and like 12, across 12 doors? And kind of the permeability of the space is very kind of present as you're in it. And the fact that you're taking the threshold and expanding it and pushing it and pulling it and kind of working around it in a way that no one can any longer like cross through the room. Like you can't even enter, and you understand the 3 doors as singular objects in this space. I think it's like such an interesting and beautiful addition to the specifics of the gallery.
You're right about gallery too. I mean, what gallery has marble walls you're not allowed to touch? You know, in a way, I think the pushback from the gallery, the fact that it is a protagonist, really, you either collapse with that or you respond to it. And I have to say that one of the things I've really been surprised by with the screens is the way the light plays through them and becomes like the marble. So the marble, I'm sure the architect was thinking, I'm going to make this marble room as an entry to Slocum Hall, and it's going to, even though these are very heavy walls, it's going to dematerialize the walls. Crazy quad matched patterns all around.
Yes, yes.
Very expensive thing to do. And I don't know if this is in one of the videos or not, but I remember saying to Michael, I never liked this room. I mean, it's a little overwhelming, but I really like it now. I really appreciate the patterns on the wall. They're all different. They're all quad match, but they're all different. And I think that the screens kind of have an interesting conversation with them. So I'm happy with that. And the light from the screens, the effects of them.
You know, I mean, as an exhibition space, because this is, as Anne said, we've used this for quite a number of exhibitions, but particularly the Bogosian fellows have exhibited here. And, you know, every fellow has had to kind of take on, as Anne did, the challenges of a space where, you know, sound is impossible. Light changes over the course of the day and over the course of the seasons. It's really quite beautiful late in the afternoon here. But you have to really stay in the room. You have to be in the room for a while to kind of understand how the light works here. But Ann and I were talking about this earlier. Almost, I mean, everyone from, you know, Maya Alam, who digitally mapped all the surfaces in here and then reproduced those surfaces in objects, to
paper.
Linda Jung, who you know, made a ceramic piece that, as it turns out, really reproduced some of the marbling in the walls. James Lung, everybody has, and Benjamin Van Moysen, who just did a show here, in one way or another, everyone has taken on, has had to take on the marble somehow. And I mean, we'll talk more about this later maybe, but for me, one of the most kind of incredible things here, and you can't see this, you couldn't see it unless you come to the room and either sit in it or look through the screens. But one of the things that Anne did, and this is a small thing, but it just works so spectacularly, which is the projection of those films on the surface itself of the marble. So
Andrew's going to show that right now, since you're talking about that, Michael.
Yeah, I'm sorry to talk about it so early, but
no,
I have to say it's one of the things that I so
that's good.
I'm just fascinated with, in part because I never would have imagined that the surface of the marble would have been a good screen on which to project. But weirdly, even more interestingly to me, is it appears really as though the image is not being projected on the surface, but as though it's coming from inside the marble itself. It looks like it's back projected from the other side.
Yeah.
But it's a small thing. I mean, it's one thing among many things that Anne did in the space, but she's, you know, taking up the challenge of the marble itself and really turning the challenge into an opportunity to do something really exquisite. I mean, I would never have thought it, and it really has worked. Yeah, it's really worked well.
Yeah, I think that you know, it gets also back to, well, a couple things. The marble, you know, marble has a very crystalline structure and it has depth in it already. So light already penetrates it pretty deeply. So I suspect that actually it's true what you're saying, that the light from the projector goes in.
It literally is coming from
penetrates
inside,
it,
yeah.
and somehow it gets, you know, bounced back. So there is that kind of feeling like you're seeing marble come alive.
It's a very deep, very rich image.
Yeah, it is really super interesting and unexpected.
Well, you know, I don't want to, I'm not going to go off on this because I could talk about this for a long time, but what I think this is something I think all designers probably could learn from, themselves probably do in any case. But when you started out thinking about this exhibition, and you've sort of alluded to this already, it was a very different exhibition, and of course it was pre-COVID. But over time, it's not just the COVID transformation that's required a rethinking, but literally almost weekly, there has been an invention and a reimagination of a surface, of a deployment of a material, of a different placement of a screen, a different use of the screen, that has made the exhibition really build up layers over time, which is really kind of inspirational, because it's not as though you had, these 20 ideas for this in mind at the beginning. They've kind of evolved as you've thought through this and excavated more of the history of the building and thought more about it. And I think this is by far the richest exhibition we've had in here. It's really one of the most rich exhibitions I've seen anywhere. I think it's just a spectacular success.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of hope that I agree, because it begins with a formal gesture. It begins with a screen that is very specifically patterned to look a certain way, but it also performs in multiple ways that echo both the history of the building and the kind of push and material boundaries through kind of processing and kind of this very rigorous investigations that Anne has been engaged with and so long. So to me, it's very interesting. There's kind of a disconnect at large, when we look at formal projects and their objectives, and when we look at a project like this that is like explicitly formal, it has a predominant form that registers as one, crosses through the atrium, but also performs in all these other layers that come, as you're saying, through the history of the building, the persistence of the design and redesign of the project.
You're talking a little bit too about process, aren't you? And I know you're going to call for another video here in a sec. I will just say that part of that process, and I think this is true for artists, right? That there's if you're working, let me back up and gather my thoughts here, but there's a back and forth between digital and analog processes here. And so the screens aren't possible without, these screens, anyway, my screens are not possible without digital processes, but they are heavily handmade as well. So there's a lot of, not just manual labor, but an intentional hands-on aspect to the mechanical fastenings. Like all of these can be taken off their ribs and flattened and redeployed in different ways because they're not glued in any way. But just the sanding, the finishing, all of that comes as part of the process. But the larger process, and I think you're both maybe alluding to this, is the initial conception, the sketches, then test models, then hands-on work, and then you get a feedback on that, and you go back again, right, through that loop. This is what, of course, I think we do as designers all the time, that feedback loop. But the actual being able to make large objects and work with them by hand, you get a lot of feedback. So it became a kind of natural process to question something and to remake things, or to figure out ways to deploy things that I had already made, like that one screen I mentioned. It's a rich process, and I think it's one that I hope that more and more becomes part of the processes that our students use, that they test things, if they can, at a one-to-one scale. It really gives you a lot back.
What do you think about the video? Maybe we can look at the process video.
The process? Yeah.
We can come back to this.
what this video is showing that I think was really a great creation of Zane's was to do a cross section from outside on what is now a balcony through the old exterior doors across the marble room and into the atrium, and then doing it again with the screens in place. So first you saw the marble room empty, and then you see the same kind of thing with the marble room full of screens. And the dean. He's got a key.
Inadvertently. I do have a key. I can do it.
So are we going to do the
Shall we-
process one?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's watch the one that says process. And they make sense together.
Yeah,
Kind of zooming out and
Yeah, right.
zooming back in.
There it is. Just want to acknowledge John Bryant and Ting Yang, who show up in that process video. John runs our wood shop, and well, we can make other thanks towards the end, but that's who was in that image, as well as Ting Yang, who has been my graduate assistant all year. Really very erstwhile and helpful comrade in arms, we'll say.
I think it's so important to, put out there that, of course, acknowledge all those who supported you, but also that to make these things, it's a tremendous amount of work, and it takes a team, and it takes, taking flat sheets of 4x8 material and bending it and making it bend, not just bending it, and placing it in its backing and all that. It's never the work of one person.
Yeah, these are, and we have a CNC mill downstairs,
Yes,
which has
we
been
do.
fantastic, very exciting, because I think I was teaching abroad when that got put in and came back, and it's very excited to see that there. And Mike Giannatatio, who runs that mill, was also really instrumental in getting these things cut. So the process is that you work for a while trying to figure out patterns. There are many laser cut models and small wood models and small test pieces over the years to figure out the patterns. And of course, there could be more patterns to come. A lot of patterns don't work or don't work well or don't bend well or whatever, but I was very fascinated with trying to take flat materials like sheet materials, like plywood, and do something to them without soaking them, but so that they could bend. So you could go from flat pack to something that becomes spatial, and to test the effects in the spaces that they make. So really that kind of became an obsession, and is maybe still an obsession. And the CNC mill is really, really important. And for a while, the only one that we had on campus was about 6 floors below ground over at the physics building, run by a wonderful man. His name is Charlie Brown. Maybe he's still there. But he actually cut the very first very small test to see whether this would actually work. And you're absolutely right. When it comes off the mill, you have a kind of rugged piece of plywood that needs a lot of help to get smooth and to get in place. And there are many, many hours to produce just one of the sheets. Really a lot of finishing work. But you know, you really get very close to your work that way.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I wanted to backtrack a tiny bit
Yeah.
and maybe go back to what you were saying, that you start with a sketch and then you go to a little model and then you go to the 3D print. That's a whole other monster, or kind of setup than the CNC. And then you go back to the model and then you feed that onto the CNC that then projects into the plywood sheet that then, it takes a village to pull off, that then, you sand as much as you sand. And then you detail in a way that kind of brings the craft back to the entire assembly. So I think it's like this kind of string of translations from hand to machine and stuff. And, on and on.
Yeah, there was this wasn't the only kind of influence, but certainly a few years ago, I had a research leave that you gave me. And right in the beginning of that leave, there was a great show at the Met in New York that was called Manus Ex Machina. And it was really about fashion design, but it was about bringing both the machine and the hand together. And I had been really interested in that, but it was just such a kind of, it just happened to be the right show at the right moment for me. And at that point, I started making some of these 3D prints that are on the table here, but trying to make them in such a way that they were a bit dependent on a hand stitching of certain elements to come together. In other words, they couldn't just sort of work on their own. They had to also have that hand stitching involved. And so some of those, you see these little pieces of thread, and that was my intent, to try to work with that as an idea. And so this guy actually is made up of several different screens, and to pull them really tight together, I use that same technique. So I don't know if it really shows up, but these kinds of ropes that you see here are actually there on purpose to pull them tight. And I grew up partly in the Navy. Maybe that has something to do with an interest in knots and making sure that things are.
Can you identify that knot?
Right. Right. But I think that there's something there about being obviously a hand gesture that I found super interesting. And yeah, I guess it goes back to, I'm always saying to the students, one good reason to learn how to sketch is that it's so fast. It's so fast. So you have an idea and you just make the sketch. It doesn't have to be a thing of beauty. And so as part of a process, I think for most artists that the hand sketch is really part of it. It's not just working in the digital environment, because you can work through ideas just so quickly, not to mention with a client, but we're not talking about client architect relationships tonight. In fact, none of my professional work in that sense, if we think about this more as research or something like that, I'm not sure how to classify it, but I wasn't really interested in having this show about the professional work, the built projects out in the field somewhere. I really wanted it to be about this kind of work in progress.
It's generative. There is something kind of morose in looking back and saying, here's my work I've done, and it's complete. And client work has that. You build something, you leave, you move onwards.
Yeah.
And with research and any given opportunity like this, to be in a space like that, it's both admired. Well, I don't know. It's kind of really fantastic to see that. Oh yeah, this is an opportunity to produce work.
Right.
I know you mentioned, Anne, which I find completely fascinating, that you have a 3D printer at home and you have a little one and you keep trying these patterns again and again.
Yeah. Well, you used the word obsessive when you first came into the room.
I did.
Think. And sometimes it's a little scary to go back into a sketchbook and realize that you've sketched something like 15 years ago and you're still thinking about it. And I get, maybe that's true for everyone. But I definitely have found that to be the case, that ideas just kind of keep rolling around in there and they take on different forms, but there's a link. Like the word interrupted also links back to a project I first did at the American Academy
Right.
a number of years ago now, Piranesi interrupted. And not to get into that right now, and there is a video that covers that, but it dealt with inscription. It dealt with this idea of palimpsest, of sort of writing and rewriting over a surface. And when I look at these screens against the marble or think about the idea of inscription in this room, I can see that that was already being played out, you know, or as another play on what I was thinking about with Piranesi interrupted. And maybe the etchings too, because that was a flatbed process of etching, which also came up in another project, Boston Interrupted, another flatbed kind of real long kind of set of prints that involved narrative, storytelling, and the CNC mill is another flatbed printer. You know, it just prints things that are thick. So it's all related.
I have a question related to the let's say the process question. And we just saw the video on that, but one of the things that happens when you work through these processes, Evie kind of just laid out a linear progression from sketch through these various means and modes of making. One thing I'm curious to know from you, Anne, is when you go from one to the other, obviously there's a translation and there are gaps, and there are things that occur in those gaps, and there are things that you learn. I mean, I was alluding to this earlier in terms of the way the exhibition itself kind of evolved over time. And we'll probably talk about screen, and we're going to talk more about screens and things later, but just the way you think you're starting out with this set of ideas, and then, you know, as Evie was saying earlier, you make something, you physically make something. It's a kind of a craft operation. It's your body, it's your mind, it's your hands. You get done with it, and then you're confronted with that, and then you have to do something with it. And then actually it's often not at all what you thought you were going to do with it. And there's a kind of an invention that comes with each of those process iterations. I wonder if that happened with this over time, and then even with this, you know, making of this exhibition.
Yeah, and you know, I know this is visible in the discussion right now. So this, if you were to see my 3D CAD drawing, this was actually much bigger. And you know, I had more than one when I started. So just from a pragmatic standpoint.
Thank you for reducing that.
But to make it, I was like, okay, not doing that one, not doing that one, you know, but
Editing is good.
But also because it was sufficient. I
Yeah.
mean, I suddenly was able to get in here and put parts of this in, and I realized I don't need that other stuff. And I don't even want to touch that wall over there. You know, so in that sense, it was, yes, it was maybe partially pragmatic, but it was also aesthetic. That you realize, even though you can measure things in something like CAD or Rhino, to actually physically be in it and realize this is big enough, and actually I don't want it any bigger.
Right.
That's part of that kind of dialogue. Another example, and it shows up actually on the table and right behind us here, and maybe that little edge shows up, I'm not sure if it does in the image. But I had these pieces of plastic that I just happened to own, and thought, well, I want to bring in the 3D prints. I think they would look really interesting on this plastic, so I'm going to bring in that too. And people started, I think, Michael, you were one of them, and Evie, you might have seen it early on too. You're like, wow, that's got this amazing light thing, and you know, how does that work? And have you lit that, or how does the light work through that? And the more I thought about it, I thought, I have more of that. And when I'm putting together these screens, I'm always a little bit concerned about these joints.
Right.
And I started putting the plastic in between the joints, which shows up in some of the other screens, not this one. And that was just a kind of reaction to a possibility, and also reaction to people's reactions. I mean, people were just, there's something, I don't know, it enhances the magical aspect, I think I would say. There's something.
Yeah, it's like it has an, it's sort of like the marble and the projection on the marble. It has there's an internal kind of luminescence. It sort of comes out of the material itself. This has turned out to be a beautiful, inadvertent sort of discovery of the feature of the edge of this plastic that turns out to be a beautiful feature of the show.
Right. I wasn't really sure if it would do the same thing without having light coming in from the top and putting a piece in between two pieces of plywood. Can that still work?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. So that was a happy answer.
Yeah, it works very well.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's something, there's something, I guess, I don't know if magical is the right word, but I'm hoping that there's something where you're not quite sure how things were made. How did they get to that shape? How were they made? I had a friend in here a couple of months ago. This piece was here, and she's not an architect, and she was looking at it, and she was like, wait a minute, I'm trying to follow the seams, but I can't find the seams. And I just was so happy about that there was something, like it's not necessarily clear how it's made. And the same with the plastic and the light.
I have a few questions here on chat.
Oh, okay.
If
Yeah.
you would like, there are a lot of comments that center around the word amazing. So lots of compliments, and
that's nice.
and I will give those to you after.
Thank you.
But to jump to the questions, I have a question from Mark Linder who says, congratulations. And he wanted us to go a little bit back to the video conversation, how the projection came upon on the marble, how it emerged in the project, and if you were to continue to pursue that, what more would you do with this double image?
Well, Zane was already working on the videos, and we knew that we wanted to have that kind of hybrid exhibition that was partly physical and partly video based, that could be online, not just to solve the problem of people are far away and let's show them something, but also a sense that, maybe this goes back to that magical, a sense that you could do stuff with the video. Actually, I remember having this discussion, now it's coming back to me, that even the screens that we had, we could arrange them however we wanted in this room before we actually opened the exhibit. We could do whatever we wanted with them and make them a kind of tribe in here, that was producing these effects. And so the videos could go, in a way, much further. You could get your eye very close to the wood, let's say. You could see lighting from all kinds of parts of the day. So there was a kind of life that came through the videos that was very important and was, I think, well captured by Zane. But then the question was, well, okay, back to the exhibit. How do we show them? And for the longest time, I was trying to figure out how to put scrim in here. For a while, there was going to be a piece of scrim crossing the room. Then I thought, well, maybe I could have it back against that wall or down in the middle. And it just didn't look right. And then there was an idea about maybe we just put white plywood up there, painted plywood, so we could really see the videos. And one day we were in here sort of thinking, well, let's look at them on the marble. And at first, I think I tried it. And I think actually it came from a discussion with Ted Brown. And I tried it, and it was really a bright day. And I said, it's not really working. Then there was a day we were in here, and you happened to come by, Michael. And Zane and I were in here, and turned it on and it was just like
It blew my
something had
mind,
happened.
yeah.
And it was
great.
like, yeah, we're not putting plywood up there. So that's maybe part of Mark's question. I totally want to video the videos because I think that there's a kind of life to that video that we're looking at right now, and you guys have seen a little bit of because of Andrew's work with the camera, so that we can capture that effect. And I think, Mark, it does have a future, you know, of thinking about materials, and I guess this would be called image and light all at once. I tried something, and it's not part of the show, but it was very exciting. I'm happy to share the videos with you. And it was just me with my iPhone, so it's really crude. But I turned the projectors here on, and their image, the Dell projector, has this bright blue thing. It says Dell. And I shined it on all of these objects, and I kind of moved it around the room, and it was kind of amazing what it did. And then I ran a video doing the same thing, and it's pretty interesting. So, as you know, since you're into image, so I hope that answers.
Yeah, I think it's like between the digital and the screens and kind of the use of the space, this, I don't know, this idea of misuse keeps coming back, where you're not supposed to project on marble,
yeah.
you're not supposed to bend
True.
plywood,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
you're not supposed to install an exhibition in a series of doors, and
Yeah.
like all of these kinds of step-by-step kind of not errors, but kind of like moments of irreverence kind of build up
Yeah.
in such a consistent
That's neat.
way.
That's neat. I was wondering, should we show the effects video, or were you holding that till later?
That's a good question. We can show it. Let's show it. It's the video that's titled "Screens," please.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
It seems like it might follow on that question.
That's true. I get excited because there are a lot of great questions in the chat. So, yeah.
Okay,
Oh.
yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the effects are beautiful in kind of the larger scale. And there is a question that's actually specific on the screens by Leah, asking that even though the exhibit is not about your professional work, have you been able to incorporate screens or studies in your built work?
Yes.
Great.
Is that from Leah Chiavara?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Leah. Yes. And part of the work, the research work, goes back to we were doing a research project for NYSERDA with a really large group of people, who technical as well as architects and structural engineers and so forth. And we were trying to figure out, and Ted was the PI actually on that project, but we were trying to figure out whether it was possible to design and build a house in upstate that was market rate, which at the time I think was $175,000, and get all of the kind of sustainable and design, things involved with it, right? So we went through a lot of iterations, but part of it evolved into something that we called the X House, and it really anticipated the screens. So part of the screen research was thinking that the house gets deployed with very, very few permanent walls within it, and a lot of these kind of moving screens. It wasn't quite like this, but that it goes back to that point. So yes, and we have incorporated them in a few projects.
It's nice to think of them weaving between kind of your professional and
I guess,
yeah, I don't know about the distinction. There's something unprofessional about this work, but yeah, you're kind of like service work versus the research geared work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. When you don't have a client-based project, it gives you obviously more freedom to experiment. And I think experimentation, particularly right now with, these are tough days, right? COVID and I mean, everything. It's a very tough time. I think it's so important to keep experimenting. It's an optimistic thing to do.
Yeah.
And, and it's great to be around the students because the students are always experimenting and I think, generally are optimistic. And it's a real pleasure actually to be involved in a field where, not just our field, but I mean like teaching as well, where you're around people who are looking to the future and even despite all the difficulties that the US and the world is experiencing right now.
I have just a question maybe related to an observation that Evie said about or made about the inadvertent or the kind of illicit use of certain materials and the discoveries you make along the way. Evie, you said earlier that the project kind of starts with a formal with formal attributes, and actually I wonder if it didn't start, and if in fact the whole thing is not about framing certain ways of perception and ways of seeing and experiencing light, because the screens certainly were formal, but they were always meant to be something that you view something else through. And even if you think about every screen, so I think it's both perceptual and about materials and about how you experience things, but I think it's also and this is to pull it back in the other direction that, let's say, from practice, I think this is an incredibly conceptually rich project. If you just think about, if we go back to some of Anne's earlier comments about this space being an in-between liminal zone. So this room that we're sitting in is between the inside and the outside of this building, but it's also now both a physical and a digitally projected space. Anne talked a lot about the extent to which her work, the screen work that we see projected on a screen that's image-based, being entirely dependent on hand drawing, but that hand drawing was dependent on a digital translation to mill it and make it, but then it had to be hand finished. So what I love so much about, I think, this project is if you go down the rabbit hole of the screen discussion, it's endless, because this room is a kind of a screen. There's screens on the doors. That's a screen. Everyone is observing this through a screen. And it becomes, a really, I think, powerful discourse and discussion about how we experience things in a world where so much of what we've been experiencing is through a laptop or a CPU and a monitor or a phone, and how in some ways it's very similar, but it's dramatically different to be sitting in a room in front of physical screens. but it's screens, and so just this kind of interplay between the physical screen, the digital screen, the physical product, the digital product being projected onto marble, shouldn't work, does. So I guess at one level, it is very formal, and it is very much about materials, and it's very much about process, but it's also really it's a very conceptual project. It's very, it's interrogating what is an exhibition now? What does it mean to do an exhibition? When we first started talking about, Anne was talking about how we, I sort of gently broke the news that we might not be able to do a normal exhibition. And Anne and I have had this conversation a number of times. This exhibition, in my view, is so much richer and so much more provocative, and is peeling away so many other layers of what an exhibition is. What does it mean, to make things now and to display them, than had we been able to do just a normal, so-called normal exhibition. And so,
Totally true.
Yeah.
Totally true. And I will never make anything in the future without having a videographer coming in the next day. No, I think that the world exists out there in Instagram. And I mean, I know just from talking with you, Michael, and also EVU, that you brought this up as something that you guys are really working on in your firm, that you can't just be in a gallery and have, put a sign outside and say, there's a show inside, come on in. It really has to be out there. And then the question is, what is that medium? Is it just there to photograph what you couldn't visit because you have, you're not in that space? I don't think so. It's got this other medium, it's got this other life, but it's still, they're codependent. So but
it's not compensatory. It's not as though this is making up for something that might have been. In fact, I think the most powerful thing about the show is the way it always is standing on this line between digital, analog, physical, Zoom, in person, not in person. And it wears both those things really, really, I think, well. It's really not one, and it's really not the other. It's both. It's really both these things.
I'm happy about that.
Yeah.
It becomes this third thing.
This third thing, whatever that is.
Autonomous from its constituent part. And I totally agree. I think my point I was trying to make was that it presents itself as formal.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
Kind of first, second, and then you understand all these multiple layers and the kind of logics behind it all. Shall we take two more questions? I know we're slightly over time, but I'm also having fun.
Yeah, great.
We can be indulgent, sure.
Right. A question from Kyle. Congratulations on the beautiful show. Excitement to see it IRL, and importantly, a public thank you for being an incredible colleague and mentor over the years. And of course, you'll be very much missed. Question. You've spoken a lot on the evolution of the project over the last year. And very good question that I also was planning to ask, where the interest in the screens begins, and also over the last many years, how might that interest have in screen and screening have changed outside of the confines of the exhibition and this marble room?
Well, for sure, Kyle, you would ask the precedent question. No, that's good. And I don't know, but I think lodged somewhere deep down in my psyche is time spent in the South. I don't think of myself as a Southerner, but we did spend a lot of time growing up in different places, Key West and Charleston and Norfolk and other places in the South, and qualities of light and air and screening. I'm looking at you, Michael, because I know you come from the South, and jalousie windows and overhangs and plantings and all of these fans, ceiling fans before air conditioning. And, you know, and I think that maybe that had some kind of, it wasn't something that I was consciously pulling up, but I think that that may have had some early influence. Certainly though, when I started taking students over to Japan with some colleagues, I have a deep appreciation for the way that screens are deployed there, and they take on so many different forms. I'm not saying they look like this by any means, but it's such an important element in a traditional building methodology there that it made me think that we really overlook screens. In fact, very early on, I had this crazy thought that this show should be called Cool House Interrupted. And the reason why was that Rem Koolhaas a few years ago had done the Biennale, right, and the elements, and screens weren't one of those elements. And I remember thinking, screens really have always taken this kind of back seat to brick and mortar and you know, structure and so forth, and they're seen as a kind of secondary element and insertion, which I'm not saying that these aren't also insertions, but it strikes me that, like with this one, really trying to move in a direction where the screen could become, at least on the table, as a primary element in architecture. And I think I get that thought from the Japanese, who, again, the screen is not a structural element there, but it's such an important part to the activation of domestic space, at least. Yeah, I don't know if that because the question was, where did it come from? I think, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
where it began in your own.
Has it changed? Has it changed? Yeah, I think so. I think the 3D printer, which is weird because CNC milling is subtractive and 3D printing is an additive process. So they're not really analogous, but in making some of these small models here, I realized that I could start to really thicken things there, and I don't know how to do that yet materially. It's not going to happen with plywood, and maybe you know, it's a robotic process, and that might change the screens really strongly, because as an additive, excuse me, as an additive process, you know, the parameters change. So I don't know, Kyle, if that answers your question.
I'm sure it does, and I hope to also, you know, see you with a robot machine. So they keep going bigger and
right.
bigger.
Some desktop robot, right?
Like robots and drones. Last question. Sufficiency, I quoted, can be a virtue in a resource-challenged universe. And I think it came in while you were speaking to how many screens are necessary and why go bigger or why go smaller.
Yeah.
But especially for design research, and your work shows us this well. It doesn't actually have a question now that I read through it all, but I think it's a good kind of argument to highlight kind of moderation, or not even moderation, but understanding the quantity of that's been in conversation without overtaking.
Yeah, because when we finish this discussion and our wonderful AV team leaves and we sort of clear a few things out, there's a lot of stuff in here, but there's also not that much stuff in here. You know, there are these screens in the 3 doorways and then the objects. And I think that ultimately did become sufficient in that sense for this show. And even yesterday I was in here thinking, do I have too many things in here? I'll have to ask somebody else to answer that question because I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
It's true in design too, right? I mean, one should always be thinking about that. I had there was a member of our board several years ago, before you came here, Michael, and he practiced in a place where people were pretty well off. And he said his biggest problem was that his clients were well off. That, which you would think wouldn't be a problem. You'd think fantastic, but they could do anything in some ways. And it was very hard to kind of pare back and do just the sufficient amount for a project. So I get the question. I hope I got the question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
On that note, any last
I
questions
want to,
or comments?
I'm okay, but I, first of all, want to thank both of you guys a lot for being here tonight. I want to thank all of you guys over there for making this possible to stream. I've been helped a lot this year, first of all, by having the year to work on this. Michael, if I had been carrying my normal load and my committees and so forth, I wouldn't have had the time. I mean, I've spent so many days down in the wood shop, and what a pleasure. So thank you for allowing that to happen. I really, really appreciate that, for curating the show, and Evie for your, curating of this whole event. I also want to thank the team downstairs in the shop. So that's, John Bryant and Mike Giannatatio, who I mentioned before, and Robbie as well, who's been very helpful. Ting Yang, I mentioned before, my graduate assistant. Just thank you, Ting. I know you know that you're even famous in the videos. I want to thank Andy Malloy and Tuck Fung for their work particularly recently with all of this kind of setup, very technically difficult. Yeah, and then of course, going back to the old days, James Hepikoski, who worked with us at MBS, really helped a lot with laying out some of the early files for the screens, way back when we weren't sure how to get them to bend. And my family, Ted Brown in particular, Peter, for being so supportive and really helpful. I mean, Ted's eyeball on this was just such a help, so thanks very much. And then, I'm still here, the semester's still going.
Yes.
And I don't really want to make this a closure on teaching, but boy, I sure really appreciate Syracuse University and all the students and colleagues over the years. But that'll continue, I hope. I'm not moving away, so.
It will continue.
Yeah. When I was leaving London, they had a little tea ceremony, and people were saying some nice things. And I said, hey, it's not like I've kicked the bucket, So, yeah, anyway, thank you. Thanks again. And
Thank you. Thanks for letting us be part of this. It's been a great pleasure to be here, and it's been really an even greater pleasure to watch the show evolve and now to see it, and it will live on in video and in many other ways. So congratulations.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, and everyone come see the show.
Yeah,
Peek in.
everyone come. Yeah, if you can, come.
Thank you. We'll
Okay.
close the chat.